In this company there rode 2 men named Jackson, one black, one white, both forenamed John. Bad blood lay between them, and as they rode up under the barren mountains, the white man would fall back alongside the other and take his shadow for the shade that was in it and whisper to him. The black would check or start his horse to shake him off. As if the white man were in violation of his person, had stumbled onto some ritual dormant in his dark blood or his dark soul, whereby the shape he stood the sun from on that rocky ground bore something of the man himself, and in so doing lay imperiled. The judge smiled. "It is not necessary," he said, "that the principals here be in possession of the facts concerning their case, for their acts will ultimately accommodate history with or without their understanding. But it is consistent with notions of right principle that these facts, to the extent that they can be readily made to do so, should find a repository in the witness of some third party. Sergeant Aguilar is just such a party, and any slight to his office is but a secondary consideration when compared to divergences in that greater protocol exacted by the formal agenda of an absolute destiny. Words are things. The words he is in possession of he cannot be deprived of. Their authority transcends his ignorance of their meaning." The black was sweating. A dark vein in his temple pulsed like a fuse. The company had listened to the judge in silence. A few smiled. A half-witted killer from Missouri guffawed softly like an asthmatic. They were about in the morning before daybreak, and they caught up and saddled their mounts as soon as it was light enough to see. The jagged mountains were pure blue in the dawn, and everywhere birds twittered, and the sun, when it rose, caught the moon in the west, so that they lay opposed to each other across the earth, the sun white-hot and the moon a pale replica, as if they were the ends of a common bore, beyond whose terminals burned worlds past all reckoning. As the riders came up through the mesquite and pyracantha single file, in a light clank of arms and chink of bit rings, the sun climbed and the moon set, and the horses and the dew-soaked mules commenced to steam in flesh and in shadow. They rode up through Cholla and Nopal, a dwarf forest of spined things, through a stone gap in the mountains and down among blooming artemisia and aloe. They crossed a broad plain of desert grass dotted with palmilla. On the slopes were gray stone walls that followed the ridge lines down to where they lay broached and tumbled upon the plain. They did not noon, nor did they siesta, and the cotton eye of the moon squatted at broad day in the throat of the mountains to the east, and they were still riding when it overtook them at its midnight meridian, sketching on the plain below a blue cameo of such dread pilgrims clanking north. At dusk of the 3rd day, they rode into the town of Corralitos, the horses shuffling through the caked ash and the sun glaring redly through the smoke. The smelter chimneys were ranged against an ashen sky, and the globy lights of the furnaces glowered under the dark of the hills. It had rained in the day, and the window lights of the low mud houses were reflected in pools along the flooded road, out of which great dripping swine rose moaning before the advancing horses, like oafish demons routed from a fen. The houses were loopholed and parapeted, and the air was filled with the fumes of arsenic. The people had turned out to see the Texans, they called them, standing solemnly along the way and noting the least of their gestures with looks of awe, looks of wonder. The judge, like a great ponderous djinn, stepped through the fire, and the flames delivered him up as if he were in some way native to their element. And when the company turned in to sleep, and the low fire was roaring in the blast like a thing alive, these 4 yet crouched at the edge of the firelight among their strange chattels, and watched how the ragged flames fled down the wind as if sucked by some maelstrom out there in the void, some vortex in that waste apposite to which man's transit and his reckonings alike lay abrogate. As if beyond will or fate, he and his beasts and his trappings moved both in card and in substance, under consignment to some third and other destiny. An ancient walled presidio composed wholly of mud, a tall mud church and mud watchtowers and all of it rain-washed and lumpy and sloughing into a soft decay. The advent of the riders, brooded by scurved curs that howled woundedly and slank among the crumbling walls. They rode past the church, where old Spanish bells, sea-green with age, hung from a pole between low mud dolmens. Dark-eyed children watched from the hovels. The air was heavy, and the smoke from charcoal fires and a few old pelados sat mute in the doorways, and many of the houses were caved and ruinous and stood for pens. An old man with soapy eyes lurched out at them and held forth his hand. "Una corta caridad," he croaked to the passing horses. "Por Dios." In the evening, they came out upon a mesa that overlooked all the country to the north. The sun to the west lay in a holocaust, where there rose a steady column of small desert bats, and to the north along the trembling perimeter of the world, dust was blowing down the void like the smoke of distant armies. The crumpled butcher paper mountains lay in sharp shadow fold under the long blue dusk, and in the middle distance the glazed bed of a dry lake lay shimmering like the Mare Imbrium, and herds of deer were moving north in the last of the twilight, harried over the plain by wolves who were themselves the color of the desert floor. Jackson sat with his legs crossed. One hand lay in his lap and the other was outstretched on his knee, holding a slender black cigarillo. The nearest man to him was Tobin, and when the black stepped out of the darkness, bearing the bowie knife in both hands like some instrument of ceremony, Tobin started to rise. The white man looked up drunkenly, and the black stepped forward and with a single stroke swapped off his head. Two thick ropes of dark blood and two slender rose like snakes from the stump of his neck and arched hissing into the fire. The head rolled to the left and came to rest at the ex-priest's feet, where it lay with eyes aghast. Tobin jerked his foot away and rose and stepped back. The fire steamed and blackened, and a gray cloud of smoke rose, and the columnar arches of blood slowly subsided until just the neck bubbled gently like a stew. And then that too was stilled. He was sat as before, save headless, drenched in blood, a cigarillo still between his fingers, leaning toward the dark and smoking grotto in the flames where his life had gone. Glanton rose. The men moved away. No one spoke. When they set out in the dawn, the headless man was sitting like a murdered anchorite, disculsed in ashes and sark. Someone had taken his gun, but the boots stood where he'd put them. The company rode on. They had not gone forth 1 hour upon that plain before they were ridden upon by the Apaches.